Hi, HRN listeners. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we have a really fun campaign and an ask for you. This 15th anniversary tour is aiming to bring you closer to unique food and music experiences in some of the most exciting cities in America. All the while, we're raising funds to support our work empowering the next generation of food system storytellers through our fellowship programs. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and be entered into a raffle in the city of your choice to win a dinner for two at a noteworthy restaurant and tickets for two to a concert at a prominent local venue. We have incredible partners in New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Asheville, and Ardmore, Pennsylvania, who have donated a meal for two and two tickets to a concert of the winner's choice. And all donations help fund our fellowship programs, where we're helping to build essential workforce readiness skills and food system storytelling skills. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
I'm Erin Fairbanks, host of The Farm Report. You're listening to Heritage Radio Network, broadcasting live from Bushwick, Brooklyn. If you like this program, visit heritageradionetwork.org for thousands more.
Hello, welcome to Japan Eats. I'm your host Akiko Katayama, a food writer and a director of the New York Japanese Culinary Academy, which promotes a deeper understanding of Japanese cuisine in America. We are broadcasting live from a studio at Roberta's in Bushwick, Brooklyn. This show is all about Japanese food and food culture. We see sushi at every deli and supermarket, but what is beyond the sushi? We hear dashi ramen izakaya, but what exactly are they? Japanese food is still a mystery for many people, and I will try to demystify it in this program with my co-guests. And my guest today is Elizabeth Andoh, who is a food writer and a Japanese cooking instructor based in Tokyo, and she founded the culinary arts program called A Taste of Culture, which offers a unique opportunity for non-Japanese people to explore Japanese culture through its food. And she's also the author of 6 cookbooks, including the award-winning Washoku, Recipes from the Japanese Kitchen, published in 2005, and she was a Gourmet magazine's Japanese correspondent for more than 3 decades, and was a regular contributor for the New York Times travel section for many years. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, delighted to be here.
And thank you for your precious time today during your short visits to the U.S.
Yeah, I was born and raised in New York, but that was many, many years ago. But it's nice to be back for a visit.
Right. So, yeah, actually, you lived in Japan since 1967 for 48 years.
Long time.
So, what made you to go to Japan in the first place?
It was what I call serendipity, sort of a happy accident. Mm-hmm. There was an opportunity for me, an unclaimed scholarship at the University of Michigan, where I was a student. And nobody else, I think, applied for it. I'm not exactly sure that I had no competition, but I believe I had no competition. And it was to go to Japan for a year, and it seemed like a more interesting option than what was otherwise going to be available to me. And on the spur of the moment said yes, and landed up in Japan and in a very rural community. So I often think that the biggest culture shock was urban and rural. I was born and raised in New York City, Manhattan, and it was quiet, it was different, and hard to believe with today's very modern toilets in Japan, no flush toilets. So it really, it was a very different era. And the family that I stayed with obviously was comfortable, very functional. It was a very appealing place to be, but very, very different from what I had expected.
Right. So that was in Shikoku Island.
Right.
It was near Osaka. So it must be really remote from even Tokyo. And
very different. And I went to Japan not speaking any Japanese, which may or may not have been a good thing. I don't know. And so the first Japanese that I learned was in the Shikokuben, a dialect, not unlike talking about America, it's sort of like the Appalachian mountain ranges. I mean, very obviously not big city. And the man who eventually would become my father-in-law at the time, there was absolutely no notion on my part that would ever happen, that I would meet one of their sons and eventually marry and stay. But so he had more time to spend with me, and he sort of spent time teaching me a lot of different things. And so not only did I sound like someone from Shikoku, but an older man from Shikoku. And when I got up to Tokyo, people stared for many reasons.
Okay. Well, should I ask you a couple of words you learned?
Hondarana? It's sort of the end of a conversation. Well, okay, see ya, kind of thing. And everybody was always saying all sorts of things to me. But I didn't realize what I knew was very specific to that region of Japan until I had an opportunity to spend some time in Tokyo.
So you were a big kid in Tokyo, I'm sure.
Right.
Right. So, and eventually after the program, you went to study Japanese in Tokyo, right? So, but did you know that you wanted to stay for a long time?
I had you asked me then where I would be in 2015, I don't think I ever would have imagined what happened. But I did know that I wanted to extend my stay, that in order to do it, certainly in the 1960s, if you didn't not only speak Japanese, but read and write it, it wasn't going to be possible for me to do anything that I wanted to. So I had found out about a program at ICU, International Christian University, outside of Tokyo, that was looking for, I call them guinea pigs. I mean, people to sign on for this program. It was an experimental program to teach Japanese to non-Japanese. And what was important was not what your ethnic background is. I'm not ethnically Japanese, but the fact that I had not been brought up in a household where Japanese was spoken or written, that I did not have any experience of kanji, of calligraphy. At the time, there were a lot of Taiwanese students in Japan, and they were not eligible for the program because at least they knew some of the calligraphy. They didn't know how it was used in the Japanese language, but the program was looking for people who knew absolutely nothing. And the fact that I spoke a little bit of Shikoku-ben was okay. They considered that nothing, and they were right. So the program was interesting. At the time, they told me it was totsuki toka, 10 months, 10 days, and it meant absolutely nothing to me. And I think probably not much to most Americans. If I said 9 months, I think most people would think, that's how long it takes to have a baby. And indeed, that's how the Japanese count.
Right.
By lunar months. And so the idea of the program was that you were to be reborn into the Japanese language. And it was just short of 1 year. And the program started with Urashima Taro, a fairy tale in Japanese. And it ended with Soutai Seiridon, the theory of relativity. And the idea was that in the 10 months or so that you were studying this, you would go from kindergarten through college and pick up lessons along the way. So the Japanese Ministry of Education has a very clearly outlined agenda for children in school, and the university had taken bits and pieces of that along the way. But truth be told, I found it harder with the fairy tale because that's very culturally specific, and it's very, very different from stories that I knew.
And lots of implications.
But one of the things that became immediately obvious in Tokyo, I had to live in the dormitory, and dormitories typically have bad food, but this was really bad. And I hadn't realized how wonderful the food had been in Shikoku. I had sort of taken it for granted. I mean, I had a few things that I found difficult, but I fell in love with umeboshi and with udon, a real udon. And
udon is the Japanese one with classic noodles, but it's famous in Shikoku Island.
Yeah, and particularly in the Sanuki area where I was. And the dashi, the stock, is made from, they call it iriko. Other people in Japan call it niboshi. It's a dried, shriveled, ugly-looking little sardine, but wow, what an impact. Umami, the word wasn't known to many people then, but it's, the essence of umami there. And so not only did I have trouble with that, I really loved that food. And udon is usually written in hiragana, which is really easy to read on menus. And so the first time I went into a restaurant in Tokyo and I ordered udon, because it was the only thing I could really read on the menu, I tasted and almost spit it out. It was that bad.
Wow.
And so I often say what got me into food was a bad bowl of noodles. It made me realize that there was an enormous difference. And what and how could you make that difference? How could I make delicious noodles and this bowl of noodles be so bad?
Right, from the same ingredients.
From the same, everybody had the same chance to make it good, and they didn't, and why not? What was the difference?
So eventually, though, after that moment, you went to the Yanagihara School of Classical Japanese Cuisine. So what kind of, how did you find it in the first place?
Interesting. Food television was just beginning in Japan in the 1960s, and no Iron Chef then, but it was beginning. And NHK, the national television station, NHK Kyo no Ryori, today's cooking, and they had a magazine that went with it. And for me, watching the television and having the magazine helped me both with hearing the language and reading and writing it. And so I would regularly, and there weren't videotapes to video, so I would have to arrange to be at a television. I didn't have the money to buy one on my own yet, but I had to be where there was a television twice a day when they would be broadcasting this. And Yanagihara Toshio sensei was one of the people on NHK, and he was amazing.
So the program was in Tokyo and for 3 years?
So when I first approached him, and then I also wrote back to my family in Shikoku and asked them what they thought. And again, the woman who would be my mother-in-law eventually said, "Oh, yes, I watch him all the time. Also, I think if you're going to learn Japanese cooking, he's the one you should learn from." So when I first got up the courage to approach him, he had never taken on a non-Japanese student before, and especially one whose Japanese was not especially fluent at the time. But he agreed, and he decided that I should start in the evening course, because I had to support myself by working during the day, and for the first year, the basics. And if at the end of that time we both agreed that it was worth going further, we would revisit the discussion, which is very sort of Japanese. You don't say no, you sort of leave it open.
Right. So, but, that's the very specific, style of cuisine. It's called the kinsaru. That's from basically developed based on a tea ceremony.
And Edo style. So a lot of Japanese cooking that a lot of people, especially in America, are familiar with, probably originated down in Kyoto or Osaka and the Kansai area. And it's quite different. This is Edo. And I think...
Edo is the old name of Tokyo.
Part of what impressed me... Yanagihara Toshio sensei was particularly a magnificent food writer, and I was struggling with reading and writing, and reading his essays were really exciting. It showed me more than this is a pencil, where is the train station? I mean, there was a reason for learning the language, because you could talk about... He was a storyteller, and he was the one who impressed upon me the story of food.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So really made a huge impression. It did decide to stay on for another 2 years. And we had a conversation about my translating one of his books.
Okay.
And I started and ran into all sorts of problems. And Yanagihara sensei was a Meiji-born man, so a very different era in Japan. And very open to thinking about the rest of the world, more so than the more recent eras of Japan, especially during the war and immediately post-war.
Okay, because Meiji period was right after the Japan opened the country after 200 years of
Right.
isolation. So.
Right. So he was very open-minded, and he thought for him, here was an opportunity to bring a message to the English-speaking world, and he had never even thought of that before. So he sort of challenged me to do that. And I ran into significant difficulties, and we talked about it, and then he turned around and he said, write your own book. So that was the beginning.
So now you're the storyteller.
And now I'm the storyteller, and his grandson is the head of the school. So a number of years have passed. He passed away a number of years ago. And his son, Kazunari Sensei, was the major teacher that I had for the other 2 years. Because already Toshio Sensei was almost in retirement when I came there. And now Yuki, the younger and third generation, is really an ambassador for Japanese cuisine outside of Japan as well. He travels as well.
Well, sounds like you totally succeeded the sensei's spirit.
I think so. I think it was Otagai-sama. It was a mutual. It was a mutual thing.
Right. I'm sure he felt you're the gift of the world.
I don't know, but he was very generous and patient, and the two were quite important in getting me comfortable with, first of all, the amount of information that I was going to be taking on, but also in terms of teaching. So he also encouraged me to teach and helped me open my school in the early 70s.
Okay, great. So basically, you studied Japanese cuisine and learned a lot from him, and you call it the Washoku. It's Washoku, right? Japanese cuisine equals Washoku. Japanese people call it Washoku. So, yeah. So, what is Washoku? If you just explain in...
Well, it's interesting. Washoku, the word itself, of course, can mean a culinary philosophy, a way of thinking about food, and it's also the food that's actually made when you're thinking that way. So let me explain just a bit about the philosophy and the thinking behind it, because then I think it's easier to understand the food itself. Lots of different people would point to different characteristics, but I usually talk about three things in particular that are important for the practitioner, the person who's going to be practicing washoku. And
it's not cooking, but practicing.
It's practicing washoku. And goshiki, gomi, goho. There are 5 colors, 5 flavors, and 5 ways of transforming your ingredients. And if you're mindful of all of them, and all of them being represented in your meal, the colors, each color, the pigmentation of food tells you about the nutrition. So if you have red, yellow, green, black, and white, those are the 5 colors, at every meal, you don't have to worry about if you've had vitamins and minerals and enough protein and enough... It naturally leads to a balanced diet if you're mindful of color.
Right. And the beautiful dishes, too.
It's also very satisfying. It's very exciting to look at it. It encourages the appetite in the right kind of way. But the next category, the flavors, let's put aside whether umami is or is not a flavor for the moment. There were only 5 in the classic way of thinking, and the big 3 were sweet, sour, salty, and then the 2 accents were bitter and spicy. And if you have a balanced meal, meaning you have some sweet, some sour, some salty, it's likely that you will avoid food cravings. You will eat an appropriate amount of food. So for anybody who's been struggling with a diet, probably the most important thing is to make sure that you have balance in the flavors. Anybody who's ever opened up a bag of potato chips and ate it all and then had to have ice cream can attest to the fact that too much salt leads to craving sugar, and the other is true too. If you've just had a quart of,
Right.
ice cream. You have to
Yeah,
have
and
some
then
peanuts.
repeat,
Right.
like a sweet juice or something.
Right. So if you're able to balance out sweet, sour, and salty, it's likely that you will not want more food than your body really needs. The bitter and the spicy are accents to add interest and also to encourage flavor. And it's interesting that, especially in America, bitter, unless you eat a lot of radicchio or endive, is not part of the meal. It's usually at the end of the meal in coffee and tea, which is unfortunate because one of the things that bitter does is it encourages the appetite. It clears your palate to enjoy something else. So rather than bringing closure to the meal, it really doesn't. It's better if you end the meal with balance rather than just something bitter. And the same is true probably of spicy as well. So if you've got your 5 colors, you've got your 5 flavors, and then the 5 different ways of changing or transforming food. We say cooking in English, and it's interesting because it implies that you're using heat. But one of those methods is nama, or raw, where no heat is applied, and yet tremendous change. Anybody who's eaten a platter of sashimi can say that it's not a fish swimming in the water, but no heat has been applied. So a lot of change can happen that's not heat.
Right, because sometimes they're marinated or cured.
And all the world of tsukemono, most of the pickles don't experience any heat either, and they're greatly transformed. So there's nama, there's raw, there's simmering, which, well, niru, it can be anything from simmering, anything in a bubbling liquid, and braising, blanching. There are lots of words in English. In Japanese, niru is sort of a category.
Yeah, we just wrap it up.
Yeah, that's it. And I think when you look at the calligraphy for it, it looks like flame under a pot,
Right.
and the lid is sort of bouncing around. So it
Exactly.
was really easy to remember how to write niru. And then there's yaku, which is to sear with heat. And again, in English, there's grilling, there's broiling, pan searing, lots of different words for it, dry roasting. But again, what's different about yaku from niru is in yaku you've got different layers of flavor. And niru, when you're submerging it in a liquid, it's the same throughout the food that's being cooked. So very different textures from searing than from simmering. And obviously from raw, where typically you have crunchy and other kinds of textures. So lots of textural difference. The Japanese don't classically or traditionally use an oven, enclosed dry heat. That's something that other cultures taught them. Fabulous bakeries now in Japan. But it was not initially part of the traditional kitchen.
Right. Yeah, I've never seen an oven when I grew up, when I was little.
And I don't have one in my house either. And when my daughter comes to visit, she often wonders how I can live without an oven. And I say, really easy. And so did you when you were little and growing up in this household. But now that she's on her own, she definitely likes to have an oven and to bake and to do things on her own. So all of those different methods give a lot of textural interest. But what I think is so interesting is these ideas, these notions, goshiki, gomi, goho, are quite ancient in Japan, at least 1,000 years, and probably a lot more. And what's so interesting is that category of method and way talks about ecosystems, because if you have only certain foods available to you, because in the old days you didn't have refrigeration, you didn't have swift transportation, you couldn't import food or really change it. What you could eat was what you had at that time of year in that location. And making it interesting, making it a full meal was a real skill. And I do think that today, cooks, chefs who are able to make a whole meal out of a single ingredient that really shows skill and talent rather than bringing in other things. So long before Iron Chef and Battle of the Daikon, 1,000 years or more, there was this notion that you could make a whole meal out of a single ingredient.
Interesting. And actually, Dan Barber of Blue Hill Stone Arts, he kind of proposing in his book, the third plate, about not changing the nature. We follow the nature. So it's very interesting that you say that.
It's understanding your ingredient and also using it fully. The tops, the bottoms, the peels, the inside, maybe even the seeds, depending on what the fruit or vegetable is, certainly. And it's an important training, I think, for anybody in the kitchen to see their food, their ingredients differently.
Great. So now let's take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about Elizabeth's culinary arts program in Japan. So please stay with us.
You still paying attention? Are you there? Hello, 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 hello. I'm talking to you. Hi. Hey, this is Jack Inslee. I'm the executive producer here at Heritage Radio Network. I've been here at the station since 2009, and I cannot believe just how much this network has grown over that time. We've been able to grow because of donations from people like you. So if you're enjoying this, if you laughed, if you learned something, contribute anything. $1, $2, $10, $100, $1,000, anything counts. And trust me, we'll appreciate seeing your name come through on the donations. So consider visiting heritageradionetwork.org, click on that little beating heart, the donate button, and show us you care. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Welcome back. You're listening to Japan Eats, broadcasting live from a studio in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I'm your host Akiko Katayama, and my guest today is Elizabeth Andoh, who is a food writer and a Japanese cooking instructor based in Tokyo. She's also the author of 6 cookbooks, including the award-winning Washoku, published in 2005. And in 1972, you founded a culinary arts program, A Taste of Culture, which offers a unique opportunity for non-Japanese people to explore Japanese culture through its food. So why did you open it?
Well, I had just finished my own formal training at the Yanagihara school, and he had suggested to me that I start teaching others, that was really the best way to continue to learn. And I agreed, and at the time there was really nothing in the English language for people who wanted to delve deeply into Japanese food. But the economics of the situation and the logistics were such that the space that I had to use fully. And so I brought in other instructors in other arts, such as flower arranging and calligraphy and things of that sort. And so besides my teaching the culinary part, there were other people who were teaching other aspects of Japanese culture. And when I tried to find a name for it, again, Yanagihara sensei suggested Bunka no Aji, A Taste of Culture. It was a way of discovering more about Japan through various different aspects of the culture. And eventually, when it finally took off, and I really had a lot of people, a waiting list of people to come into the program, I decided to make it just culinary.
Okay. Right. So is it a 2-week program, 3 days program?
No, at the beginning, it was a regular course of study, and it was mainly for people who were the foreign residents, expat community that was in Japan. There weren't as many tourists in the early 70s. And I did work through some of the hotels which did have tourists. Right. So I did have programs twice a month that people could sign on for the day before that day, and it went through the concierge desk of the hotel. And it was a very different kind of program. It presumed that people were curious about unusual ingredients that they could taste here, that they might have had at a restaurant. Right. It wasn't really about making it for yourself. And so I developed a lot of one-class programs, self-contained, And a lot of people would sign on for many of them, and that was fine. But I made sure that if people were just interested in fish or they were just interested in sea vegetables, particularly kaiso sea vegetables were just puzzling to most people. Miso, you would walk into a supermarket and there were 2 shelves of maybe 150 different kinds, and what next? I mean, why would I choose one instead of another? And obviously they were not the same. So I did a lot of tasting programs and would give out recipes and samples, but it wasn't so much about making the food as much as about making people feel comfortable with the food and wanting to know more. And so the actual curriculum and the format of classes has changed over the years.
Okay. So right now, if our listeners go to your class...
Please do. So come. Please give me advance notice. It's so difficult. I just finished reading email this morning of people who are going to be in Tokyo next week, and the answer is I can rarely accommodate you with only a week or 10 days notice. I do put together some regular programs. The next intensive, if people are going to be in Japan November 16, 17, and 19. My 3-day intensives are 2 days back-to-back, a day in between when I give you homework assignments, independent study, and then you come back and we do a happyokai, a sort of recital menu, together on the last day. So there's still 2 places left if people want to be able to come to that. And then I also do tasting every year about New Year's food, very special New Year's food called osechi.
Right.
And that's December 5th.
It's a big deal. It's like Christmas and any holiday plus Thanksgiving.
Well, Thanksgiving. I think it's almost more like Thanksgiving because it's a family holiday.
Right.
It's not, New Year's Eve is not when you go out to
you
party.
don't get drunk.
No. You go to the local temple or shrine, usually the temple, ring out the new year, come back, and slurp noodles, long noodles, for a long life. Right.
Okay. So, all right. So I will give the information at the end of the show to the listeners. So let's talk about your books, because I really think your Washoku book is beautiful and very informative. So let's. I want to mention 3 books, latest 3 books. But first, Washoku. What is Washoku?
So it's this mindset of using food fully and well, and especially the 5 colors, 5 flavors, 5 ways. And in the book Washoku, I try to give the philosophical background, the story behind the food, but also very practical, so that I'm enabling people to understand the components, the building blocks of flavor, and how to assemble them. It's interesting. I often think of it almost as a kaleidoscope, where you're shifting and changing and getting different patterns. There aren't that many pieces. There's red, there's yellow, there's blue. But depending upon how you arrange them together, there's almost an infinite variety of food that you can produce.
Right.
And so particularly in Washoku, I was trying very hard to give people those very basic building blocks.
For home cooks.
For home cooks.
Right.
Very definitely home cooks.
And the second book, Kansha, Celebrating Japan's Vegan and Vegetarian Traditions. I found it very interesting because it's vegetarian cooking and it's not necessarily always vegetarian Japanese.
Right. Well, it's interesting how it became vegetarian, actually vegan. My original proposal to the publishers, Tensby Press, included a recipe for hone senbei, bone crackers. The whole idea was to use food fully, to take a look at a food and not waste any part of it. And indeed, there are some fish where even after you've filleted the flesh and you've done something with it, you can fry up the bones and they're quite delicious.
Right.
So that was part of, it was a bit shocking. There are also some fish where the scales are edible if you deep fry them, crunchy and delicious, better than potato chips. And so that was quite surprising to my editor. And they were intrigued, and I started to write the book. But then, quite frankly, the marketing department got back and said, we've got a lot of people who are asking about vegetarian cooking. And I said, sure, there's more than enough for a book in that, and so it shifted to vegetarian. And then they came back and said, can you make it vegan? And I said, well, what do I have to do to make the difference? And the answer was eliminate eggs. And I said, okay.
Wow. But,
So-
basically, excuse me, vegetarian cooking, it's rooted in a Buddhist philosophy
Yes.
too, which is deeply, used to be before, a long time ago, there's no meat in Japan that was eaten by the public. So it's kind of a natural consequence that you had a vegetarian cooking book.
I think so. And also my mother-in-law was vegetarian, shojin, in the way that many women of her generation, she was also a Meiji era person, was. And she would cook meat for others, but she did not eat it herself. And I think one of the things that impressed me, especially the first summer in Shikoku, was how she could feed people. And she was also feeding many of the workers at the factory. My father-in-law had a factory.
Wow, it's like
so
a
it was like a
restaurant.
little restaurant. Yes, it was like a little restaurant. And how she could feed them so fully, so well, so satisfyingly, with such bare essentials, and transform everything into delicious, nutritious meals with almost nothing. It was really just amazing, the magic that she worked.
So the title Kansha, it's appreciation, right?
Right.
So is it related to...
It is. It's interesting. Washoku is only about food. That's what it means. But the word kansha in general is used in Japanese to talk about appreciation or gratitude. But it's interesting that when you talk about food and you use the word kansha, you're really talking about two things at the same time. You're talking about appreciating nature and what nature can provide you, but then you're also talking about people, clever, interesting, resourceful people who take what nature gives and feeds others and satisfies others. So I think my mother-in-law was definitely one of those people who saw the potential and possibility in what nature had provided and turned it around to feed people very well. And so the sense of kansha went not only to the farmer, to the fisher person, but to the person in the kitchen who's making that transformation happen.
Right. And also to the nature, because that's why they don't
Absolutely.
waste anything.
Nothing.
Right.
Nothing.
Okay. And the third book we're going to talk about, this is
Yes.
Kibo. It's brimming with hope.
Right.
And the recipes from stories from Japan, in Japan's Tohoku.
Right.
And obviously Tohoku is, the Tohoku
disaster.
earthquake and the tsunami in
Right.
2011.
Right.
So is that the motivation that you wrote the book?
Yes. What happened was, so most of the years I spent in Japan were either in Tokyo, primarily in Tokyo, but also in the Kansai area. Because of my husband's business, we actually lived a double life, Osaka and Tokyo, for many, many years, had two homes. And Shikoku, because still had ties back to Shikoku. I had visited the Tohoku, but I hadn't really explored its food at all. And it just so happened that I was in Tokyo on March 11th. I had a program scheduled to teach on March 12th. I had come up from Osaka the night before in order to prepare, and literally thrown off my feet in Tokyo. And I was quite sure it was the big one that everybody had talked about, and then finally listened to the emergency radio station and discovered that the quake had actually been in Sendai. And I knew enough of the geography to know how far away that was and how devastating it must have been. And later in the day, watching the drama unfold, I wondered what I could do. I knew that I would be in the way if I physically tried to go to Japan, go up to the Tohoku and do a soup kitchen. I had done that in Kobe in 1995 when they had a big quake, but I was considerably younger and it was a different situation. So I was wondering what I could do, and it occurred to me that the best thing that I could do was to tell the story of the food and do it in English, get it out there to the rest of the world, and especially before it would change and morph into something that nobody would recognize. Obviously, it became very obvious very early on that there would be mass evacuations and that people would not be able to resettle again. So I did most of my research through blogs. Japanese language blogs, because I couldn't go up there. I did follow up with some phone calls when communications were reestablished. It was really devastating. And eventually, a year later, went up to the Tohoku, all 6 prefectures, not just the 3 that were affected most by the disaster, and traveled around and actually met people. But the initial manuscript for that book was written basically on finding people through blogs.
Okay, so it's a cookbook, but also kind of
It's stories.
Stories.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the cover photograph is a plate of rice balls.
Right. So it's interesting that up in the Tohoku they call it onigiri, and when I had first made acquaintance with them, they were omusubi, and because that's what most people in Shikoku were calling them back in the 60s, and they're really the same thing. And so the first story that I tell is about how this omusubi maven became an onigiri expert up in the Tohoku. It was the first food that survivors got to eat.
Okay.
So it was made, and I tell the story of a group of very multicultural, very just a group of people who came together, including Muslims. They used a mosque in Tokyo to actually make thousands and thousands of onigiri and got them up to the Tohoku. And it was the first food that most people got to eat and sustain them until they were able to have warm food and other things to eat.
That's great because to me, onigiri, omusubi, that's at the heart of Japanese.
I'm curious, which word did you grow up with?
I think onigiri.
Onigiri, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a feeling it's not really geographic and it's not really gender. Sometimes women use one word and men use others. In other things in food. But it's interesting. Most people in Shikoku call them omusubi and most people in Tokyo call them onigiri.
Yeah, I grew up in Tokyo, so
they're good, and you can put almost anything you want in the middle. The ones that actually went up to the Tohoku originally were umeboshi, pickled plums, partly because they wouldn't spoil, and that they were actually chopped up and mixed in with the rice, and then formed into the balls with the nori around it.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm sure onigiri made a lot of people who have suffered.
The only sort of discussion that I had with my publisher was I didn't think that 3 should be on the cover because nobody got 3. You were lucky if you got 1.
Wow.
And they said it just didn't look right. So the cover was 3, and it was part of hope, and hope that you would get to eat more than 1. But most people got 1.
Right.
And that was it.
Wow. Okay, so hopefully a lot of people keep reading Kibo.
I hope so, and a portion of the proceeds go to the Tohoku to jumpstart new business up there, and particularly in the food world. And this coming March will be the 5th anniversary, and I'm currently planning to do a number of fundraising events here in America. I don't have the details yet, but when I do, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. Oh, I'd like you to come back.
Yes.
Yeah, we are unfortunately running out of time, but you have so much to talk about because it seems like you understand Japanese cuisine more than the average Japanese people.
Well, I realized the other day when you pointed out that I had been there 48 years, that makes me living in Japan longer than most Japanese.
And deeply. I think you're...
It's my home. I love to come back to New York, and it's very exciting, but I'm hoping that everyone will come visit me in Tokyo.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to know more about Elizabeth's books and the culinary program and everything coming up, please visit tasteofculture.com. And if you have any questions or comments about the show, please contact us at heritageradionetwork.org. And by the way, we just launched a beautiful new website, so please visit our page, Japan Eats. And Japan Eats is live on at 3 p.m. on Mondays and always available at heritageradionetwork.org, iTunes, and Stitcher Podcasts. And today's show was made possible by Santori, and our engineer is Liz Smith. I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to this program on heritageradionetwork.org. You can find all of our archive programs on our website or as podcasts in the iTunes Store by searching Heritage Radio Network. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at @heritage_radio. You can email us questions anytime at info@heritageradionetwork.org. Heritage Radio Network is a 501c3 non-profit. To donate and become a member, visit our website today. Thanks for listening.